Hello, this is Christopher John Björknes. It is Thursday, June 12th, 2008. I have a new and very interesting guest who has issued some very thought-provoking ideas and theories, and he supports them with a great deal of historical evidence. His name is David Livingstone. Can you give us a summarization of your worldview of Western civilization and how in its cultural, historical, artistic, and societal aspects it came to be?
Sure. Basically, it would be the thesis of my book titled The Dying God, The Hidden History of Western Civilization. I called it the hidden history because what I do is I uncover the role of the occult, which has been completely neglected by mainstream historians. But it's only by looking at the occult that you can properly interpret what's being offered as the history of Western civilization. But ultimately, there is no such thing as Western civilization or a history of Western civilization. It's a modern invention. It goes back to largely the turn of the century when Rockefeller and Carnegie decided to appropriate the American...
Sorry to interrupt you. You cut out for a couple of seconds there. You were talking about Carnegie and Rockefeller, and I would add that they were great influences in the American educational system and deliberately tried to turn Americans away from higher education and towards the trades and other things, especially in New York City around the turn from the 19th to the 20th century. But I'm sorry, but you were cutting out right at that point.
Well, they actually took over the entire higher educational system, the university system of the United States. There's an excellent book on it called Universities in a Capitalist State by Clyde Barrow. He takes a bit of a leftist interpretation of it, but despite that, he doesn't offer any theories. He just offers you case by case of how these two boards of trustees essentially took over the university system. And what they did, essentially what they needed in World War I was a reason to justify America's involvement in the war. So basically they created this notion of America actually being part of a Western civilization, which they shared with England and France, and opposed to the East. It was largely from that point on that this notion of a Western civilization is being promoted. But ultimately it comes back from Hegel, because up until the time of Hegel, there was a common acknowledgement that Greek civilization, because this has been a recurring theme throughout history, that Greek civilization derived many of its ideas from the East. But it was Hegel who first suggested that, yes, okay, ideas from the East, but the influence was minimal, and it was the Greek genius that transformed it. And his idea of that is basically what led to the complete neglect of Eastern influence on Greek civilization and the idealization of Greek society. And we also have to wrap into that his interpretation of history, which is ultimately derived from the Kabbalah. It's derived specifically from Lurianic Kabbalah.
Now when you speak of Hegel, we are talking about a highly influential German philosopher who applied the dialectical method to history and said that history was a struggle of forces and that great men made history. And he also tried to define cultural and societal norms in a way that could very easily fit in with the Kabbalah. And he was influential on Marx and many other people.
Absolutely. The reason Hegel is popular, because otherwise there's no reason for it, is because he's the great oracle of the Illuminati. And it makes sense when you see that his philosophy was derived from Isaac Luria. And Isaac Luria developed what's called a new Kabbalah, or modern Kabbalah, which would be in the 16th century.
Yes.
So the notion that he developed was the idea that God needed an other to know himself. So he created an other of himself, which was man.
Now, do you view that as a dialectical process where you have the thesis and the antithesis forming a synthesis?
Essentially. So the history of humanity is man or God coming to know himself. So man progresses from the lowest of knowledge and advances through history growing intellectually until he finally reaches the end of history, when you get the Superman of Nietzsche, who is the first to be able to finally proclaim that he is God, or finally recognize. He thinks he recognizes that he is God.
The Uberman.
This is the Antichrist, of course. So this is how the idea of Greece as the cradle of civilization was born. That Greece were supposedly the first free thinkers, which means that because religion is considered the most backward form of human intellectualism, and the pinnacle of human intellectualism is atheism or Kabbalah. So kind of the birth of the intellectual progress of man would have supposedly begun with the Greeks, who questioned religion, and the philosophers were the first to, look outside themselves and try to define what they believed reality to be. This is completely incorrect. And it's all part of this modern myth-making about Greece. The Greek philosophers were not rejecting religion, they were rejecting the traditional pagan faith, but they were replacing it with Kabbalah. You see, what the historians forget to remind people is that that Greek philosophy came to life in the 6th and 5th century BC, not in the Greek mainland, but on the western coast of Turkey, in Ionia. And that was a part of the world that was, at the time, under Persian occupation. So it's funny that we don't refer to that as Persian philosophy, but as Greek philosophy, merely because it was in the Greek language. It's obvious when you scrutinize it that it was founded on Persian, or should I more specifically say Babylonian influence. So the first thing we have to do to understand about is you have to look at the birth of the Kabbalah. And Kabbalah, usually when people use the term, it refers to the mystical tradition in Judaism that began in the late 12th century Europe. But it's understood to have had a much more distant past, and that past is located back in the Merkaba tradition, which really flourishes in the 1st century AD. So the question is, what influences brought about the emergence of Merkaba mysticism in Judaism? So there's various claims that, it was partly Greek, that maybe it was partly Iranian. So there's a confusion as to, or I guess Egyptian in some cases, or Gnostic. There's a confusion as to which direction the influence would have come from. And the confusion that it's not recognized that the Greeks, in turn, got their influence from Babylon as well. And the way we can identify that is that, first of all, we have to go, if we look at Merkaba and the emerging Kabbalistic ideas of the 1st century AD, they're all similar to ideas that were associated to who were called the Chaldean Magi, who are a Babylonian Magi. Now, I try to keep this as simple as possible, but it gets complicated. So please call me back if I stray too far. But it gets into detail, unfortunately, which is a little thick. But this has confused scholars because when they look at Persia, the Persians were following the religion of Zoroaster, and the Magi were supposed to be Zoroastrians. So they compare Greek philosophy or early Kabbalistic tradition and compare it to Zoroastrianism, and they say, look, there's no similar. It's not possible for Zoroastrianism to have influenced Greek, and if it did, only very, very, very slightly. What they don't understand is that there were two Zoroastrian traditions. There was one which was Orthodox, and the other one which was heterodox. So in our time, the tradition that we have become familiar with Zoroastrianism is the Orthodox one. But in the ancient world, outside of Persia, the mystics through whom the rest of the world came to know Zoroastrianism were the heterodox Zoroastrians. And these they called Chaldean Magi. And they had nothing to do with Orthodox Zoroastrianism. It was a thorough heresy and a thorough bastardization of Zoroastrianism. Had no relation to it. It was basically mystery schools that appropriated a whole stream of Babylonian.
May I interrupt?
Yes.
Do you believe that there was such a person as Zarathustra, and that the historical source of Zoroastrianism has a foundation, and how did this split occur into heretical views of it, the way that Christianity broke off into Gnosticism and then was codified in the Council of Nicaea?
Well, we have to understand, first of all, that the occult tradition throughout its history has been based on pseudo-epigraphical works, right? So most of the works are ascribed to certain religious figures, but didn't really belong to them. So like the Book of Enoch, which it was claimed to have been written by Enoch. And there's books of Abraham and books, right? Just like the Gnostic books ascribe books to Jesus or Mary Magdalene and so on and so forth. It's part of this occult tradition of creating these these pseudo claims. And Zoroaster would be very much the same. And I believe that probably some of the Greek philosophers, they did the same with some of the Greek philosophers. So Gnostic books were attributed to Zoroaster early on, before Gnosticism emerged. They're attributed to Zoroaster, but he had nothing to do with them at all. It's just part of the culture, the occult culture of appropriating certain characters, I guess, for some form of disguise or legitimacy or whatever it is, whatever purpose that they
or proselytizing.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, I do believe there was a true Zoroastrian faith. I believe it was monotheistic, but it was misappropriated, and that took place in Babylon. So when you go back to the ideas that emerged in Merkaba and you compare them to the ideas that were attributed to the early Magi, it's obvious that they're essentially identical. But most of these ideas were new. And at what point can we identify their emergence? And it's very easy. They emerged pretty much all of a sudden in the middle of the 6th century BC.
The time of the exile of the Jews, supposedly.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the majority of the Jewish population were being held in exile in Babylon at the time. And this also happens to be the century when astrology emerges and becomes kind of the core philosophy of the emerging occult tradition. And it's basically right after this time, also somewhere around there that Zoroaster emerges, but it's also after this time that you have the emerging influence of the Magi.
Now, the exile was supposedly brought about by God as punishment for the Jews for apostasy. Do you believe that there is a relationship between the emergence of these occult beliefs and the exile of the Jews?
Absolutely. Because at the heart of this Magian cult was the worship of Mithras. So this is in contradiction to true Zoroastrianism, although there is some reverence for a Mithraic character. But Mithras was the Persian version of the dying god. And the Babylonians had their own version. It was Marduk or Bel. The Jews had been worshipping Baal. And but otherwise, he's basically, just like the Egyptians had Osiris. There's many versions all over the place. The Greeks had Dionysus, and so on and so forth. So Mithras was the Persian version, and what they did, they exchanged names is pretty much all they did. So they retained this pagan tradition, which they had falsely adhered to for, I guess, nearly 1,000 years until the exile, and now disguised it in Persian theology by giving Baal the name of Mithras. But otherwise, the occult practices were the same. It involved mystery rites, it involved human sacrifice and intoxication and black magic and all the same things that were traditionally involved in the practice of the worship of Baal.